to the Dutch Kills Civic Association Meet the Candidates video series. My name is Antonio Spenatatos, the president of the association, and our guest today is Suraj Patel, who is running to become the congressperson from New York 12th District. Suraj, welcome.
Thank you for having me here today.
Well, quite welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself to our membership and let us know how you came to be in this position?
Sure. My name's Suraj Patel. I'm an attorney, an activist, small business leader, and first-generation American. And, you know, I decided to run for Congress because we desperately need change. Look, this is the most important election of our lifetimes, right? And one candidate is going to say, hey, experience, stay the course, the economy is great, let's not make a change, you know, it's too risky. And that person could very well be Donald Trump, or it could very well be Carolyn Maloney. If you want change in November in this country, and we desperately need it, then we have to lead with change in June. We cannot keep returning the people that embody some of the worst things about the system back in place and then complain about the system, right? And so, you know, I got to live, my parents came here from India in the late 60s. And like so many other immigrant families, you know, we started a business. My dad was a lifelong union member, an MTA worker. When I was 5 years old, I actually could remember my dad would come home in the morning when I was on my way to school because he'd worked the night shift fixing track. And we joke that two things have remained the same in the last 30 years. The condition of those tracks and your representative. And we need change. We need bold, progressive representation that refuses corporate PAC money, that's beholden to the people. You know, we're in Dutch Kills right now. Guess what? It shouldn't take a primary for your congressperson to care about Queens.
Right. And we will get into some of those concerns a little later on.
Yep.
But before we delve into that, question has to be asked, are you qualified to be the congressperson from our district? Why? Absolutely.
I mean, I think that I share more of our shared lived experiences than anyone who's been in office since 1982. Let me tell you, just from a personal standpoint, I ran for Congress 2 years ago. I'm currently running again. And even I know what it feels like to be surrounded by staff, to fall into this sort of you know, everyday same routine of talking to people and explaining your positions and your views and the problems of the country, and then sort of be insulated from that. Can you imagine doing that for 30+ years, and how many things have happened in our economy, the future of work, technology, et cetera, that you've been completely cocooned off from to represent? So let me give you a story. You know, I grew up filling vending machines, sweeping parking lot floors, doing laundry. I played hide and go seek in motel laundry rooms with my brothers on the weekends, because that's what we did to build our family business and live our American dream. And I got to become an attorney in New York City and then work for the greatest president of our lifetimes, Barack Obama. And I carried his bags, I opened his doors, I cleaned up after he left, and I got to see hundreds of thousands of people every few days, because I was traveling advance 7 days ahead of the president, watch what a campaign feels like when we are, as Democrats, boldly leading with an inclusive, positive vision for the future. I got to work for the president and then become a lawyer. I had to help run my family's companies through 7 bankruptcies when the financial crisis hit. I didn't take payroll for 2 years in order to make payroll for 2,000 employees. Those experiences, I think, qualify me to be in Congress far more than simply having been in Congress. That simply holding a job doesn't entitle you to keep it. We have to have representation that actually understands regular people.
Well, let's get into some of the issues that have been selected by our membership. All the questions presented were solicited through the membership of the association. All right, so the first issue we're going to bring up is the post office. Now, the United States Post Office has a history of not accurately and consistently delivering the mail to the Dutch Kills portion of New York 12. There are a very large number of residents, many of them seniors, who are completely dependent upon that service. If you are elected to Congress to represent us, what actions would you take to address this problem?
Oh, you'll be surprised. I think it's not just a Dutch Kills problem. You know, my campaign office is on 10th and Avenue B, way off in Alphabet City, and historically also bad postal service. We have people come through the office all the time talking about that, and it's interesting because it's something probably I would have never organically thought of as an issue to focus on, and yet you're right. So many people rely on this, and it's unacceptable to have sort of the, let's call it, forgotten parts of our district consistently forgotten when it comes to basic services. Firehouses, post office, school, parks. You know, I know that we're just renovating the Dutch Kills playground here, and the tennis courts are being left out of that. I just don't understand. I think there's a priorities question. You should have a congressperson that prioritizes everyone in the district, all parts of the district, not just the parts where they reside. And I think that is just sort of decades of neglect.
Okay. The federal representative of one of our neighboring districts, New York 14, has recently called for the United States Postal Service and the Federal Reserve to expand the post office services. They're calling upon the post office to offer financial services, including ATMs, paycheck cashing, bill payments, and electronic money transfers, in addition to cashing treasury checks and issuing money orders,
Yep.
which they already do. Is that an initiative that you would support?
I'm 100% a huge proponent of universal banking. That I think it's sad that you know, developing countries have been able to bank 100% of their population. I think India, for example, is about to bank 100% of its population, and we here in the Bronx have one of the lowest banking rates in the country. Specifically, postal banking, I know, is one popular initiative. We are actually looking at that, but I think I'm more interested in any solution. And one is that very easily the Federal Reserve could be mandated to open up bank accounts for every single American. And I don't necessarily think they have to be postal office served banking. It could be electronic. By and large, you don't have to do that. So I'm not sure what the most efficient way to get there is, but I would be a proponent of mandating the Federal Reserve to create bank accounts for every single American, and then to be able to put cash directly in the pockets of Americans who need it the most via services rather than through intermediaries. And I think that should end payday lending. It should end some of these usurious and unfair, unethical business practices.
Fair enough. One of the most polarizing issues, or one of the most hot-button issues in this district, is housing, specifically affordability of housing. Inside the New York 12th district, there are thousands of units being used in part or exclusively in the short-term rental market through sites such as Airbnb. Do you feel this market should be regulated, and to what extent?
I do. Let me just admit, though, that I have used Airbnb in my travels, and many people have. And I think it's quite a service for people, and you're traveling with large families like mine, you know, and it makes traveling affordable, and I think it's in net something that's good. Now, does it need to be regulated, especially in New York? Absolutely. When you are permanently running your home as an Airbnb, then you are a public place. You should be regulated for ADA requirements, taxation, services, safety, you know, health and fire, in a way that commercial buildings are. So I don't think it's fair to let folks permanently operate a hotel, essentially, as an Airbnb. So I do believe that should be regulated. But I think on the housing, there's a bigger issue here. As Billionaires Row lays vacant and empty, there's a market failure happening of the kinds of housing that New York needs that's not being built, while luxury housing developments that are remaining vacant are being built. And there are ways to incentivize us to build the right kind of housing. What New York really needs a lot more of is rental property for people who can't afford massive down payments, and starter family housing, because it's become way too expensive to raise a child in the city that we love. And we should not be losing hundreds of residents a week to that expense, because that's what makes New York great. This is a family place. And we should never cede the idea that this city is not for families, and it's just for some transitional period in your life, or you've already been here. So I think this is a big problem.
Well, I'd like to get back to the regulation of Airbnb and get into some specifics. Should rent-controlled or Section 8 tenants lose their lease for short-term subletting?
I have not looked into that. It seems on its face value to make sense to not be able to take advantage of a program that it gives you assisted sort of housing pricing and then profit off of that. I need to take a look at a proposal, but yeah, I think that on its face makes sense.
Okay. Should fair market value apartment building owners face penalties for reserving units for short-term rentals?
Yes, it seems to me that, again, if you're saying reserving units, as in operating units that were meant to be housing for families as a motel, essentially, then yes, that seems right.
Okay. What about single-family homeowners? Should they be penalized for using their space for the short-term rental market?
I think that becomes a little more difficult, because if you're a homeowner, again, same thing though, I still apply anything to where if you're constantly running your home as a permanent hotel, then you would probably need to fall into commercial use, ADA requirements, health, fire, and safety requirements, and those kinds of things, bar none. Okay. If you're a single-family homeowner who is 2 or 3 times a year leaving town and renting this thing out, then that is probably in the spirit of what Airbnb is supposed to be for.
Okay. All right, we're now going to switch gears, and I'm going to ask you some questions about the funding of your campaign.
Sure.
All right. Is your campaign funded solely by small dollar donations from individuals?
My campaign is funded solely by donations from individuals.
Has your campaign received any funding from the Democratic Party at the local, district, state, or national level?
No, in fact, as a person who challenges a sitting incumbent Democrat, we face a blacklist from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, so that even vendors who want to work with them, with national Democrats, are prohibited from working with us. So the deck is stacked against us, but we actually find that we like the folks who want to work on insurgent campaigns anyway.
All right. I'm going to go up. I'm going to ask the questions just to make sure that the audience has a full purview. Has your campaign received any funding or support from a connected PAC, like from the American Bankers Association or the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Unit?
Mine certainly has not, but one of the people in this race is almost exclusively or over 50% funded by those.
Okay. Has your campaign received any funding or support from a leadership PAC, like from the Majority Committee PAC or AmeriPAC?
Nope.
No. Has your campaign received any support or endorsements from a super PAC, like the Congressional Leadership Fund or the American Bridge for the 21st Century?
No.
No. What position do you take on the funding of elections in our government?
I think we need to have publicly funded elections in government. Let me tell you, the single worst thing about running for office is trying to raise money in order to be able to compete and run for office. I think it has a distortive effect on our democracy. I do not believe that corporations and their PACs should be able to contribute to campaigns. You see, I'm an ethics professor. When an individual contributes to a campaign, you have to ask what motive they have. Now, individuals have lots of motives to contribute to a campaign. Perhaps they want hope. They like your message. They want representation. In my case, I get a tremendous amount of my funding comes from the Indian American community, because there's not a single Indian American in office in New York City, not in city council, state senate, or assembly, not in the House or statewide. And that's embarrassing, but I think people want to see one of their own, someone from their community, just like it has always in the past, as ethnic groups have moved to America and become second generation and part of the fabric of the country, that they want to naturally see themselves, and their folks in office to understand their issues. So there's a lot of good reasons why humans may want to give to a campaign or support a campaign, volunteer for a campaign. There's only one reason that corporations want to give to a campaign.
How about a single-family home?
Return on investment. They don't have hopes and dreams. They don't have other motives. And we have seen time and again examples of the corruptive influence of money in politics. But when you're you're an incumbent and you call yourself a progressive, but you take over 50% of your contributions from corporate PACs, the very same companies, Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or the American Insurance Group, that you then regulate on the Capital Markets Subcommittee, it begins to question whether or not, or what you mean by progressive.
Okay. Now we're going to switch gears one more time to Amazon. Amazon's another hot button issue for this neighborhood.
Kind of figured that was coming.
Yes. So Amazon recently withdrew their proposal to move part of their headquarters to the Long Island City Dutch Kills section of New York 12. Did you have a position on that move? And what was it?
I did, and I will point your readers or your viewers to a long-form piece I wrote for the Century Foundation. I'm a policy fellow, visiting fellow at the Century Foundation, which is a progressive think tank. And I will shoot that to you so you can sort of distribute that around. But it's a nuanced look at this back when it was happening. Okay. But to answer your question right here, look, that was an opaque process from the governor and the mayor railroading this thing through without community input. And that was unfair. And I think I'm opposed to that. I'm opposed to corporate subsidies being given to companies that aren't paying their share of taxes. Now, corporate subsidies have been used as of right for a long time to generate economic development in places that need it. And to some extent, some of these were as of right based on the laws on the books. And I know that. And so that there was some nuance in this. It does make sense to sort of draw large corporate headquarters or job-creating, good job-creating companies to, say, South Bronx or places that otherwise Manhattan would just get them all. So I understand some of that. But the process was bad. Amazon does not deserve subsidies. But as a steward, as a fiduciary of the residents you represent, I was in Queensbridge a lot trying to help make sure that the benefits of whatever Amazon's headquarters would be would accrue directly to local source preference hiring, job training, STEM education. I think it's important that your congressperson be at the table to make something better and try to make something work for all the residents, especially the ones who would stand to gain the most with jobs and things like that. So I don't think you can just be derelict in your duty and say, you know what, 25,000 jobs is pretty good and would have been a beneficial thing to some of the residents here, especially, again, neighboring Queensbridge, Ravenswood, that could have really stood to benefit from jobs, so long as we force local source preference hiring, schools, etc. So I think you should be at the table. I think what frustrates me is that leadership isn't lamenting an outcome after the fact that you could have prevented. And as Amazon withered in the wind, you have a representative who should have been at the table, making the deal better, making it work for the community, but making sure that jobs come to the community. Not just be silent in the face of a political firestorm and not input there. You basically had a congressperson who is negligent in their duty to shape the deal.
All right. Now, you spoke about the subsidies in the Amazon deal and that they were questionable. Under what circumstances do you feel using federal money, federal monetary incentives for private industry, when is that appropriate?
Whew. Look, we now have a wide body of research showing that most corporate subsidies in this race to the bottom is rent-seeking behavior that does not contribute to the economy, does not contribute to growth. We've seen that evidence place after place after place. And so the federal government especially, you understand when some municipalities say, you understand when some municipalities say they need some facility built that otherwise the economy couldn't support without some incentive, and you say, okay, fine, that's, some getting a, I can't think of something off the top of my head, getting a school built in somewhere, a private school, whatever. What I don't get, though, is when you engage in this race to the bottom in a sweepstakes way that isn't net. But the problem is these states and municipalities are different. We talk about the devastation of union jobs in the upper Midwest. And we talk about China and Mexico and NAFTA, but really, where those jobs went is to Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, places like that were low tax, non-union, and offered, billions in subsidies to bring them. So this is detrimental to our own country.
What metrics would you use then to determine whether a corporation could receive tax breaks? What rules would you put in place?
I can't even think off the top of my head why a corporation should receive a tax break from the federal government.
Okay.
Everything's being developed in the United States. I don't even understand where that would happen. I'll tell you what we are pushing, though, is we're going to be launching a moonshot in research and development that's publicly funded to public universities to create the science patents and things for the 21st century, for pandemics, for climate, for vaccines, those kinds of things, in a publicly owned way. Public research and development is at its lowest level it's been since over 100 years. If we're going to compete with the world, we cannot just rely on our private corporations to fund the types of research needed, the basic research needed for some of our most pressing problems. And the fruits of that research are going to be available for anyone and all to use. I'm subsidizing the public, not a private corporation. But we desperately need investment, if that's a different way of putting it.
Understood. Should marijuana be recategorized from being a Schedule I drug?
Yeah, I've been a longtime supporter of legalization.
To what extent?
So I think marijuana should be legalized under the same types of rules as cigarettes. I think that smoking in public places, in schools, et cetera, shouldn't be allowed. Smoking is all smoking. I think that
recreational, you think, is appropriate?
I think recreational is appropriate, yes. Okay. I think that the war on drugs has been a categorical failure.
Age limit?
21 is the cigarette smoking limit, right? So 21 is the new cigarette limit.
I'm actually not certain. I thought it was 18, but
it just changed. Weirdly, Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell got together in the strangest way to raise the smoking age limit, which is strange. I don't know what the motives there were, but okay. They did. So
you would have marijuana mirror that?
I'd have marijuana mirror that. I think in New York we're looking at 18, but at a federal level I'd mirror the federal smoking policy.
All right, well, let's go back to, you talked about the war on drugs. Do you feel that the federal war on drugs has been effective?
I think the federal war on drugs has been a failure from the standpoint of targeting communities of color. We have the highest incarceration rates in the world. 25% of the world's prison population lives in American prisons. We only have 5% of the world's population. If you're a black man and you're born today, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated or under parole or having had an interaction with the criminal justice system by the time you're 30. It is a moral disgrace, but also just an economic waste for us, for so much potential. 40% of Chicago's general budget is spent on policing. We spend a lot of money in black and brown communities in this country. We really do. But we're spending them on the wrong things. We're spending that money on over-surveilling, over-policing, over-incarcerating, and putting into a cycle of poverty some of our most at-risk populations, rather than creating economic development and opportunity and education. Education without economic opportunity is a canard. So both those things need to go hand in hand. You can't just say to people, hey, how come you're not taking care of yourself and lifting yourself up by the bootstrap if you've created conditions in which they can't ever find gainful employment and start building wealth.
Well, in that line, if you were given carte blanche to change our federal drug policy, what changes would you implement? How would you address those issues?
I think that First off, we talked about marijuana. I think that we should be legalizing marijuana, taxing and regulating it. I think that that seems to be the right play. Prohibition failed, war on drugs has failed, and here we are again in the same argument. Then I think we should be retargeting enforcement towards, high-level groups, cartels, things like that. We shouldn't just be locking up every single guy on the street who's at the end chain of something that you're constantly playing this cat and mouse game. It's like a whack-a-mole game. It's not fair. And people are able to get themselves out of legal trouble if they have money. But we're criminalizing poverty in so many instances through our enforcement of this war on drugs.
Okay. In line with criminal justice reform, stop and frisk and broken windows policing have been a highly contentious and polarizing issue amongst New Yorkers. The evidence points to these programs disproportionately targeting lower-income minorities. However, many claim banning their use undercuts the NYPD's ability to effectively police and ensure the safety of our communities. What measures would you advocate for to ensure community safety while protecting the civil rights and liberties of our most vulnerable citizens?
Well, stop and frisk was found unconstitutional, bar none. Simply put, it's unconstitutional. So I don't care if if people think that there's a lot of things that would be unconstitutional that may be effective and vice versa, not just policing, but in a lot of things. But we live in a nation of laws, not men. And the law of the land says that stopping somebody for how they look is unconstitutional. Thank God for that. So that aside, I recognize that the NYPD needs to be able to do their jobs. But they need to find probable cause before you search somebody. That's just the law of the land. And I'm sorry, but that's what we have. That's the constraints in which we have to deal. That being said, we stopped stop and frisk several years ago. Violent crime levels have dropped to its lowest levels and continuously drop. Now, I know that there has been a slight uptick recently in crime, but that can't be correlated with the ending of stop and frisk, which had happened several years ago. So let's find another problem. Let's find another solution. Let's find economic opportunity. Clearly, this is a hot-button issue right now, but it was wrong and should be treated as such once and for all.
As a quick addendum, are you a supporter of body cameras on law enforcement?
I am. I am a supporter of body cameras on law enforcement.
Okay.
And I think that NYPD ought to be too, because what do you have to hide? You will create trust in the community. Policing and community trust have to go hand in hand, and they do. By and large, bulk of NYPD members are civil servants that are doing something that we need in this country or in this city, and we should be supporting them, and we should be partnering with them. And we should be partnering with them to engage the community and be trusted by the community so they can do their jobs more effectively.
All right, now a slightly less contentious issue. One of the fastest ways a congressperson can provide help to their district is through Constituent Services. Someone in the district reaches out to help, and the resources of the office mobilize to provide that help.
Sure.
How would you ensure that constituents know your office can help them? What outreach efforts, partnering with nonprofits, and how would you expand upon the current system in New York 12 where a request can only be made in person or by mail? If so, how would you make that expansion?
Well, I mean, the obvious, what we talked about at the beginning of this interview about having lived through the technological advances and revolutions of the internet, the computer, the cell phone, and using these services in a way that the rest of us all do, because I wasn't cocooned off in a congressional office for the last 30 years, probably gives me a big leg up on how you provide customer service, let's call it, to your constituents. We would, of course, partner with as many organizations, nonprofits, and outreach groups as possible. We would obviously allow you to submit requests and ask for help online. I mean, that seems like a very logical thing. So things like that, you know? I mean, we'd explore, I'd even explore a 311-like line. You could do a lot of different things to help people, which is what you're supposed to be doing in this job, not making it harder.
Down the hill is the Ravenswood generating station in New York 12.
Okay.
It is in the Dutch Kills neighborhood. It is also one of the top polluters in New York State, and its emission directly affect the health of hundreds of thousands of neighboring residents, many of whom are in the district. It provides power and heat to over 20% of all of New York City. How do you propose we address the damage caused by those emissions and work to prevent future health issues while also ensuring that the city's energy needs are met?
Well, New York is long past time to implement 100% renewable energy standard. I supported that in the state Senate when it was up, and I know we are on our way to that now. So, unfortunately, of course, this takes time, building power plants, building solar, wind, and I think tidal and wind in off the coast, Long Island, and in the Narrows is on. I know that Andrew Cuomo proposed it to replace the generating capacity of these. So we are now in that moment. I think that I think it's long past time to have shut down oil and coal plants.
Okay. New York 12 also encompasses large swaths of waterfront. Much of the area is in the FEMA flood evacuation zones.
I'm in it. I live in it.
Yes, as does most of this neighborhood. What ways would you assist our city and state in protecting the district from damage caused by the next superstorm?
Yeah, first off, let's just, you know, when people say climate change, future issue, whatever, climate change has happened. It's already happening. Superstorm Sandy happened, is a direct result of climate change. We should be calling it precipitation change because that seems to be the most catastrophic effect that affects people. Forest fires, bush fires, droughts in farming communities. This maybe is how Democrats should start talking about this issue because it's much more poignant. Anyway, that aside, I live right off Avenue B on the Lower East Side in East Village, and that is in the flood zone as well. We had water in Sandy. So I am acutely aware of this. And right now on the Lower East Side, we are having this discussion about building a giant seawall, concrete wall, to bury current East River Park in some decade-long project that we know how New York City construction projects work, that maybe when I'm retiring at some point in my life, will we get use back of that park. It's unacceptable. And honestly, this is a global problem and a nationwide problem. And it can't possibly be, the solution is not possibly to build giant wall barricades around all of our cities. The bulk of our economy lives within the coast, on the coastlines, and it can't be. So we are exploring some really interesting things with experts, scientific experts, and plan to release a project about living shorelines and non-contributing to climate, because building a concrete wall contributes to climate change on top of everything. Living shorelines and a proposal with oyster beds, mussels, reeds, those things that prior to dredging up this harbor existed on this harbor to protect it. There's a lot of evidence around other hurricanes and even from property insurance companies' pricing differentials that shows how much less damage occurs when these sponges, these natural sponges, exist on our coasts to protect our coastlines before versus places that have sea berms. So you need to have some imagination to think outside the box to solve the problems that are facing us in the 21st century. You cannot keep going back to the same people for the same tired answers who aren't thinking outside the box. I read this incredible story about Columbia, so the L train, which bisects New York's 12th district, was going to be shut down after years for the Sandy repairs. After years of public meetings, outcry, anger, this was going to happen. And it took a team of people from Columbia University to look at the problem over the course of 6 weeks with fresh set of eyes and come up with a different solution, which is to use ultrasound technology to inspect each concrete platform that need to be replaced and see which ones need to be replaced and fix them one at a time at a significantly lower cost so the L train's not shut down. I guess what I'm saying is it takes people with fresh perspectives rather than trying to do the same thing that you've been doing year after year after year and expecting a different result. We're the crazy ones if we do that. So yeah, we need to explore living shorelines and coastlines. This could be a model for the nation on how to protect a harbor.
Fair enough. Are you satisfied with the response and assistance FEMA has provided for the storms that have occurred in the city?
No. And I think New York tends to get not its fair share in many cases due to political reasons or because we're somehow accepted out of real America, as they say, in Washington. And I think we need fighters for New York. Every dollar that New York has sent to the federal government over the last 30, 40 years now has yielded back 78 cents on average as a state. We're a net payer for this country. We're the country's economic engine. For decades, New York's hard-earned dollars are being used to pay for bridges in Texas and roads in Alaska, and we have not gotten our fair share back for our infrastructure, for our public housing, and you know, maybe it just takes vocal, activist representatives to say no more. You need to invest in this city because this city is the capital of commerce for this country.
And that is a perfect segue to our next topic, which is everyone's favorite, taxes.
Mm-hmm.
The federal tax rate for all corporations is 21%. For individuals making $55,000, it's 22%. For individuals making $160,000, it's 24%. And the federal tax rate on money made by trading stocks is 15%. Is the tax structure we currently have effective and appropriate?
No.
What changes would you make to it?
Well, I would first off, I would repeal the Republican corporate tax cut giveaway, right? It didn't result in any of the benefits, growth benefits they said they would. Bulk of the money was used in stock buybacks. Look, I think the tax code needs to be more progressive. I think that we are doing our working people a disservice by taxing them when you're still then forcing them to rely on Medicaid and SNAP and things like that. I don't think you should be paying taxes. Standard deduction should be raised so that you shouldn't be paying taxes if you're under the poverty line. How are you expected to get out of that? And I think we need wholesale reform on that. I think capital gains should be taxed at the same rate as labor. I think if you make money working hard, you should be taxed for that at the same rate as if you make money by trading stocks passively. And I'm not the crazy person here suggesting that, because as recently as the 80s, it was Ronald Reagan who suggested that. So, you know, I'm not out here, you know, talking to you from some crazy loony left position. I'm talking to you from what had up until very recently been the normal position. But all this ties back to money in politics, right? The corrosive influence of money in politics, campaign contributions, and corporate PAC money lead us to have representatives who prioritize corporations and the ultra-wealthy over the rest of us.
Okay. The current political climate has consistently seen proposed budget cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. At the same time, right now there's a desire to expand those same services. Do you feel these federal programs are effective? And what changes, if any, would you pursue in them if you were elected to represent us?
Those three programs, especially Medicare and Social Security, are America's social safety net. They are instrumental in ending or significantly lowering adult poverty. You know, it used to be that you would live impoverished after you retired if you didn't have a massive nest egg set aside for yourself at the time you need money the most. And you couldn't get insured, which is why we created Medicare, because you're expensive at the end of life to insure. These programs need to be protected and expanded where possible, bar none. That should be our first priority. That's that.
I think that's a fair answer. Do you have any policy plans in place to ensure that the senior population of New York 12 does not face any housing, healthcare, or food insecurities?
You know, we have senior policies in place, but we don't necessarily just call them senior policies, right? Like I told you earlier, expanding and protecting Medicare and Social Security, you know, things like that, we are obviously pushing. From the standpoint of being a senior in this district, being a young person in this district, being a middle-aged person in this district, the affordability crisis affects us all. And I think that I've always said you shouldn't have to choose between having a family or retiring and living in the city that you love. We need more housing, affordable housing, public housing, housing of all kinds, and we need more assistance to people on fixed incomes with cost of living increases, Social Security, Medicare, and expansions.
Okay. All right, now we get to the fun part for you, because it's not focused on one issue. You get to write the script. If you could enact any 3 specific policy or legal changes at the federal level, the moment you're entered office, you come in and it gets done, what would they be?
First, easily, I would reform the structure of our democracy. And gerrymandering, universal voter registration, Election Day is a national holiday with early voting available. Because one of the problems we're facing is, and we've been derelict in our duty as Democrats to expand voting rights. Large majorities of Americans want action on gun control. Large majorities of Americans want to protect Social Security and Medicare. Large majorities of Americans want action on climate change. Truly, large majorities. And yet all of those things are bottled up and stopped because of institutions like the Electoral College, gerrymandering, voter suppression, and things like that. So as much as the shiny object that Democrats tend to chase is services or reform first, say Medicare, expanding health options, et cetera, this is the cause of all causes. Getting money out of politics. This is what's going to get us to a much more representative government down the line.
Okay.
So that's if I could wave a magic wand.
That's the first one.
That's the first one. We need action on climate change yesterday. We need action on climate change long time ago. And that needs to be everything on the table, national mobilization of a Green New Deal type policy, where we are partnering with the private sector, the public sector, research institutions, launching moonshots in innovation that we are going to spread around the globe, because this is a global problem. It doesn't matter if we go to zero emissions in America. If India, China, and Sub-Saharan Africa continue building coal power plants at the clip they are, it won't matter to us. So we need an international, full-scale mobilization to fight climate change. Okay. It is the existential threat we face. Third one, you know, this is one that we find 10% of our federal budget is spent on children. 2 weeks ago, I launched the Family Opportunity Guarantee, which is a suite of 5 proposals that, if enacted, would halve child poverty in America in the first year alone. Child poverty costs an enormous sum, and it's a moral and economic disgrace. The policies are paid family medical leave for all parents and adults, Medicare for kids, a public option for childcare. Childcare in this city is more expensive than college tuition. Nationwide pre-K. And lastly, this is I think the most innovative part that's been getting a lot of attention, a universal child allowance. $500 per child per month up until the age of 5, and then $350 per child per month after that until 18. There is work being done in our country every single day that is involved in raising children, but it's not being compensated by our economy. When you have a child, you're usually somewhere between your 20s and your 40s. That is when you are earning the least income. And it creates an imbalance, and it stops people from having kids, and this assistance would help with that. But here's the catch. The current regime of alphabet soup of tax credits, child tax credit, dependent care credit, EITC for people with kids, that alphabet soup of things already costs this country $300 billion a year. And it doesn't go to the people who need it the most. Because if you don't make enough money to receive the credit, then you're below the poverty line and we're not helping you. Our program, the allowance, is much more in line with how families budget. You receive your money, $500 every month at the end of the month or the beginning of the month, and that's how you budget anyway, rather than a lump sum $6,000 at the end of the year. In a nearly revenue neutral way, we'd replace that whole regime with a universal credit. We talked about universal banking. It go hand in hand. It goes right to the pockets of families. And by reducing child poverty in half, the number of people who would be using Medicaid, who would be on SNAP, which is in and of itself a pretty broken program that's been captured by the agricultural industry, big agra, would come off the, would reduce those roles as well. So we're talking about something that has 7-to-1 growth effects when you spend $1 on a child. Better test scores, better health, better outcomes. And a country that's not spending money on its future, on its children, is one that is backwards or just holding on to what it has. We can't be like that anymore.
Fair enough. Now I'm going to make it a little harder for you. Out of election reform, climate change, and child poverty, of those three, which is the most important to you and why?
Least sexy, but still election, government, let's call it democracy reform.
Okay.
Because I think the other things can follow if and only if we reform our democracy to make it more representative and more accountable to the people, to get corporate money out of politics, to get our representation to be more reflective of the will of the people. So until that stuff is done, I think if we reform our democracy, some of the other things will naturally follow, even if I can't wave my magic wand. But if we solve climate change, you can bet that in the corrupt structure of our democracy, this rigged system that we have now, that'll be clawed back some years from now. And the other stuff won't be passed. So Donald Trump wasn't popularly elected. Let's not forget that in a normal system that was actually representative of the will of the people, he would be nowhere near the White House and would still just be a constituent of New York 12 living in Trump Tower.
Okay. All right, now I'm going to yield the floor to you. Is there anything you would like to inform our membership about? Any pressing issue or opportunity that you would like to share with our viewers? The floor is yours.
Sure. I mean, you gave me the opportunity to give my bold, new, unique policy. So I will avoid repeating the Family Opportunity Guarantee, which, by the way, isn't just about child poverty. It's universal. I think one of the things that Democrats need to refocus on are distributive programs like Social Security, like Medicare, that are popular because everyone gets them, rather than only talking about redistributive programs. That they have more longevity. Look, I mentioned this earlier, but progressive is a label thrown around by everybody under the sun these days. And I imagine progress means something very different to me and you and the people that are viewing this than it does to a career politician. For me and you, progress wasn't an option. It was required. I told you we grew up working in the businesses that my parents were building, living our American dream, going to college, becoming an attorney, working for the greatest president of our lifetimes in one generation. Can you imagine my parents coming here in 1968 and imagining that their son in one generation would have worked for the greatest president of our lifetimes and then also is running for office? I was posed that question today by a reporter, and I was taken by it a bit. It's a remarkable thing. And we need more of that in this country. But you shouldn't have to explain in a progressive, dynamic, diverse district like this why your incumbent congressperson takes more corporate PAC money than Mitt Romney. You shouldn't have to explain why your progressive congressperson voted for the Iraq War, sided with Trump on Iran, voted for a border wall in 2006 before Donald Trump even proposed it. You shouldn't have to explain why your congressperson spent decades spouting anti-vaccine conspiracy theories from Congress like Donald Trump. We already have plenty of anti-science people in Washington. We don't need another one. So change, I understand, can be scary, but sometimes staying the course is the more risky choice. If you're satisfied with the condition of the country now and the condition of our democracy now, then please go about staying the course. But man, sometimes it behooves us as a generation, as a country, to create wholesale change in our representation, because the system that we have come to abhor so much cannot be fixed by the people who created it.
All right. Mr. Patel, thank you very much for joining us. This has been outstanding. And thank you for joining us. This is the Dutch Kills Civic Association Meet the Candidates series. Our guest today has been Suraj Patel, who's running for New York 12's Congressional District. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.